One is Rett's disorder. One is autistic disorder or autism. Then there's Asperger's disorder and atypical autism or PDD-NOS. And basically they're all under the same umbrella because they have a pattern of deficits in communication, social interactions, and interest and behaviors. Now, Rett's disorder is the only one of these that they actually have a genetic marker for. So you can do a test and see if you have Rett's disorder. They used to think Rett's disorder only occurred in girls, and it was very rare. I mean, I've been in this field 20-something years, and I've known one child with Rett's disorder. I've known no children with childhood disintegrated disorder, so that's even rarer than autism. So basically, when they're talking about autism spectrum disorders, they're talking about autism, PDD-NOS, and Asperger's. They're not talking about the other two. In the new DSM, they're changing the name from pervasive developmental disorder to autism spectrum disorder, and there's one diagnosis. They're getting rid of all of these subtypes and just saying you have autism spectrum disorder instead. And I'll go into why when we get into that criteria. Okay. So how are they diagnosed? Basically, we're diagnosing on observable behaviors. Except for Rett's, there's no genetic test we can do, or there's no medical test we can do to diagnose an autism spectrum disorder. We can't take blood, we can't look at urine, we can't do an MRI and say you have autism. The studies into that do show that people with autism, adults with autism, tend to, some of them say, about half of them say adults with autism have larger brains than the typical population, larger weight. The other half say they have smaller weight than the typical. So they can't even, get this one consistent finding across that. So there's nothing at this point we can do. We're looking at a pattern of development. It's not just saying you have social problems, you have communication problems, you have behavior problems. We have to have a certain number of each of those and a certain pattern. And that's why a lot of people think, oh, well, my child's not talking, he must have autism. Well, he has to have social problems that go along with that as well. And once we get into the criteria, we'll see that. Developmental history is important because they have to start showing signs before the age of 3. We have to go back and say, what were they doing socially before 3? What were they doing with communication before 3? We have to go back and look at that. You do see kids that don't meet the developmental history part. They were basically perfectly fine until 4, 5, 6, and then they started showing signs of autism. Those kids would get that diagnosis I was talking about, atypical autism. So it means you have autism, but you didn't meet the typical pattern of development for autism. Or you could have what they call sub-threshold behaviors, where it's not really, you have real social problems, but communication issues are sort of slight, and it is causing problems for you. So you don't meet the full criteria of any of the other disorders. So what's the difference between a medical diagnosis and an educational eligibility? And as I said, one doesn't guarantee the other. There's a lot of parents that say, look, my child has autism, but at school, they don't have him under an autism eligibility. Why? There's also kids that have an autism eligibility that don't have a medical diagnosis. And people want to know why. Shouldn't they be the same? We're looking at different things when we go through this diagnosis. And we're going to go through all that, so you'll see that. Now, there's some states where if you get an autistic disorder diagnosis, you automatically qualify for special education. Georgia's not one of those. There's some states, if you have an Asperger's diagnosis, you do not qualify for special education because your disability is not severe enough for you. So some of it is political on what the diagnosis is and things like that, but they're trying to change that by making it just one big disorder and calling it autism spectrum disorder. Get the political nature out of the disability. So to get a diagnosis of autistic disorder, according to the current DSM-IV, does everyone know what the DSM is? I keep throwing that out there. Anyway, this is the criteria that medical professionals in America and Canada use to diagnose disabilities that don't have a medical cause for them. Basically, you need 2 of these behaviors. You need qualitative impairments and reciprocal social interactions. You only need 2 of these, okay? You need either a marked impairment in the use of multiple nonverbal behaviors to regulate social interactions. So it's not just nonverbal problems, but it's to regulate your social interactions. I've heard of a lot of people that say, well, the child gives eye contact, so they can't have autism. If you think about eye contact, that's only one nonverbal behavior we do. I mean, a lot of kids with autism, if you've ever worked with them, you see they don't talk with their hands, which people say I do all the time, and I am not Italian, like everyone thinks, because I talk so much with my hand. They don't do that sort of thing. They're not going to, sort of indicate that they want something by pointing to it. And that's one of the first signs to look for, is your child pointing? If they're not pointing by age 12 months, they say you should get them checked out for autism. And we can confidently say by 12 months if a child falls on the autism spectrum or not. We can't say specifically is it autism, Asperger's, or PDD and OS, but we can say they're on the spectrum. And there is research going on at Emory and another group at Emory that is looking at eye tracking as a way to diagnose kids with autism, or at least identify children with autism, at risk for autism, by 6 months of age. And just by watching what they're looking at, they can tell or predict if the child's going to have autism or not. So we are bringing that diagnosis down. And part of that group is really trying to get this eye tracking in every pediatrician's office. Because I don't know if you know, but the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended every child be screened for autism at 18 months to 24 months. Because they want that early diagnosis and early treatment. Another thing a child with autism has to have is failure to develop peer friendships appropriate to their developmental level. Now that gets hard because you may be looking at it saying, and we see it all the time, an adult who's 20 years old but has severe cognitive impairments, so developmentally he's at a 3-year-old level. We're not evaluating his peer friendships at the 20-year-old level. We're looking at them at the 3-year-old level. And so we may say, no, he doesn't have this behavior. And people are like, what do you mean he doesn't? He's not interacting like a normal 20-year-old would be. But that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at their developmental level. So you really need to get a good idea of where they are developmentally as well as chronologically. And in there you may see kids from anything that are oblivious to other kids being around. You put them in a room of kids and they just sit on the floor and don't notice there's kids around them. To kids that have sort of, I'm interested in you because I want what you have. And so I'll interact with you to get what I want, and then I'm not going to be interacting with you. To kids that have a real interest in other kids but don't know what to do, so they interact really sort of oddly with them. We had one child at our preschool that when he was about 3, 2.5 to 3, every time we wanted to interact with someone, another child, he'd take them, push them on the ground, put his face in their head, and go back and forth. Because that's how he learned to interact with other kids. That meant I want to play with you. And other kids did not take that well as I want to play with you. So he had that interest. We just had to teach him an appropriate way to express that interest in other kids. You also see kids with autism have a lack of spontaneous seeking to share enjoyment, interest, and achievements with others. So they're not going to tell you when they necessarily want something. They're not going to initiate interactions with you. Young kids, a lot of times when they make something, they just made a mud pie out in the backyard, they're running in and saying, Mommy, come look, and you're like, oh, you have to act like that's the most exciting mud pie you've ever seen. Kids with autism aren't going to do that. They're just going to make it and go out. They're not going to start that interaction with you. They also don't engage in what we call joint attention. And that is another early sign that we see. So if they're interested in that artwork, they're not going to look at you, look at the artwork, and look back and sort of do that sort of like, look what I'm interested in, let's make sure you're looking at it. They don't engage in that. What they may do is look at you and look at the artwork, but they don't ever look back to make sure you're following their gaze, or they may just look at the artwork and expect you to know that's what they're interested in. So they're not doing that joint back and forth. And they won't necessarily follow yours. You may say, look at that. And they're looking everywhere but over there. So they're not following your initiations of joint attention as well. They also have what's called a lack of social and emotional reciprocity, which is basically a fancy way of saying the give and take of an interaction. But these are kids that aren't going to respond to their name, no matter how much you call them. You can be standing right behind them and calling their name, and they don't respond. Or they're going to interact with you on their terms. As long as you're doing what they want, they'll interact with you. But if you try to change that play or that interaction, they're going to keep going and doing what they want. They're not going to follow with that. It's not going to have a back and forth nature to